Welcome to This Month in Mormon Studies, a monthly podcast recapping the comings and goings in the scholarly study of Mormonism, co-sponsored by Kofford Books and the Mormon News Report. I'm Brian Whitney, and with me tonight is our only slightly curmudgeonly co-host, Brandt Malone. How you doing, Brandt?
I'm doing great. Only slightly today. You guys have caught me in a good mood.
So before we get started, though, I think we should apologize to our listeners because, we sort of skipped last month, Brandt.
We did. It was a little crazy last month for both of us.
I guess we didn't really sort of skip it. We skipped it. I mean, let's call it what it is, right?
I mean, credit where credit's due. We really tried like 3 or 4 times. Okay, we're going to do it this week. We're going to do it this week. And it just didn't work.
Well, I had this elaborate excuse worked up that August was just a bad month to do this stuff in. It was named after Roman Emperor Augustus in like 1097 CE, and it was really a product of the Great Apostasy, which we reject, right? So, but I thought this was such a profoundly dumb excuse, I just won't even attempt to use it. Right?
My excuse was the start of football season, and I like my excuse better than yours.
Yeah, your excuse is probably a little bit more realistic. Yeah. But let's go ahead and get on with the news for September.
Sure. So we've got a lot of it. So as far as news goes, the first of a 4-part series of panel discussions on the intellectual legacy of Mormonism took place at the University of Utah this past September as part of Professor Brian Birch's course, The Intellectual Life of Mormonism at the University of Utah. This panel discussed the legacy of intellectual Mormon figures such as Leonard Arrington, Hugh Nibley, Sterling McMurrin, and Lowell Bennion. Panelists include Greg Prince, L. Jackson Newell, Boyd Peterson, and Mary Bradford. No word yet if the video will be posted to the Tanner Humanities Center's website. I've been in contact with them. I'm waiting for them to get back in touch with me. Hopefully by next month I'll have a definite update if we're going to get those videos out there or not.
These are the people who really shaped where we're at now.
And the nice thing about it, too, is all 4 of those are very different personalities who have different views on Mormonism and things like that. Yeah. So it's not like you're just getting this huge swath of, all intellectuals are the same. It shows this great diversity among them. Deseret
News put out an interesting article that I think is kind of fun. It's the top 10 treasures in the church history library. Now, let's just go ahead and count these down real quick. Number 10 was President Hinckley's sketch of small temples. Number 9, Emmeline B. Wells' editorial and the Women's Exponent regarding grain storage. Number 8, the letter from Liberty Jail, signed in Liberty Jail by Joseph Smith and the men that were jailed with him, used as sections 121, 122, and 123 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Number 7, Joseph Smith's first journal. That's a big one. Number 6, Wilford Woodruff's copy of the Book of Commandments. I've actually seen that one. I actually held it once, and that is kind of a cool one. It's much smaller than you would expect. Number 5, fragments of the papyri scrolls. Number 4, Hiram's copy of the Book of Mormon. Number 3, the 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon. Number 2, the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon, seeing a trend here. And number 1, patriarchal blessing records of all members. I mean, that was so sentimental for them to put patriarchal blessings of all members in there. But, missing from this list, if we had to add our own, no mention of the seer stone. I mean,
no,
that's pretty darn cool.
And that's what I was hoping for. Like, I was reading it going, okay, we're getting down to number 1. Lots of Book of Mormon stuff. They've got to do the seer stone as the number 1 thing. And then it's the patriarchal blessings. And I was like, of course the Deseret News is going to make you feel all warm and fuzzy.
Right. How adorable. I mean, and I was also very disappointed to see that the Sword of Laban didn't make it on the list, which we all know they have. Right.
Yeah. The Utah Territorial 2nd District Court has digitized and put online records pertaining to the trial and conviction of John D. Lee for his role in the Mountain Meadows Massacre that happened circa 1875 to 1877. They can be found at the Utah's Division of Archives and Records. The records in this case file cover Lee's first trial that began in July 1875 and ended in a hung jury, as well as the subsequent second trial where blame for the massacre was placed squarely on Lee. This led to his conviction and sentence of death by firing squad, said Glenn Fairclough of the Department of Administrative Services in a press release. So this is kind of a big deal because this continues that trend of documents that were previously more difficult for people who weren't directly in Utah to get them. If they're digitizing this and putting this out online, that's going to make researchers and people who are interested in looking at this, it's going to make their lives so much easier.
What I find fascinating is that it was the Utah Territorial 2nd District Court that's had these records all the time, which makes sense because that's where the trial took place. But you figure that with given enough time passing over a century, that they would have donated these to the church archives by now. So it's fascinating to me that it's not only them that still have the records, but that they're the ones that are actually hosting the digitization of it. So you don't see district courts doing that very often. So let's move into blogs.
So a big thing that happened during the month of September was Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, turning 50 years old. Michael Austin at By Common Consent had a really, really good piece. I just want to read a little bit of it. He said, Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, turned 50 this year. So do I, and the similarities don't end there. Both of us were polite and orthodox in our youth and reasonably well-behaved into our adolescence, but we both started to push up against institutional boundaries in our early adulthood. We tried hard to walk the line between scholarly inquiry and faithful discourse, but it was a tough line to walk, and sometimes we ended up too much on one side or the other. A lot of our friends left the church, but we both knew we never could. Mormonism was too much a part of our core identity for us to ever give it up. It's a really touching, great look back at the effect that Dialogue has had. And if you're looking for a sister piece to that, Jana Reese also had a very good piece up at Flunking Sainthood called Why I Still Need Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, which covers the role that Dialogue played in her life. And Brian, I'm not sure if you had a chance to go to the Jubilee. The pictures and the feedback that I heard was just a perfect celebration for Dialogue's 50th year.
Lloyd from Great Kofford Books, our managing editor, went. He said he just had a great time and just great speakers. And
I think in this age of podcasts and blogs and Facebook and Twitter and all these quick hits that you can get, the discussion seems to happen among some circles. Okay, is there still a need for dialogue? And I think that the positive impact that dialogue had and being able to just attend this celebration and see the positive impact that dialogue has, it still shows that there is a value and a need there for dialogue. And I really hope that people don't take it lightly and don't, they don't look in their archives with all those free issues that you can have and say, oh, okay, this is good enough. Like there's still the fall edition of Dialogue that's coming out this quarter, which is Greg Prince's article on gerontocracy and LDS leadership, is going to be really, really good. And that's one of those things where I'm hoping people say, oh, this is a cool celebration. Maybe I should go and look into what else is coming out, and hopefully they get interested to keep Dialogue a viable source of Mormon scholarship.
Speaking of Michael Austin, who apparently owns the Bloggernacle now, he wrote another great article for By Common Consent titled Not Even Close, Faculty Gender Balance at the BYUs. And in it, he wrote, as a senior academic administrator, I worry quite a bit about gender disparities in our faculty, and I spend a significant time paying attention and trying to make sure that we close the gender gap. For reasons that I will explain at the end of this post, I consider this essential to the core values of higher education. Does my alma mater think the same way? How do the ratios of male and female faculty members at the 3 church universities compare to their peers? Inquiring minds want to know. Spoiler alert, it's not good.
Speaking of that gender and employment at the BYUs, Christine A. at Wheat and Tares wrote a really great companion piece to that, where she said what is instructive is that it isn't specifically our belief that women should be in the home that feed into these numbers, because Michael, shows how we hire women in droves to fill our support staff positions, which are less flexible and family-friendly than faculty positions. Since I've worked full-time as support staff in the administration building at BYU, Idaho, I thought I'd share one experience I had that helps to explain this disparity. This seemed to be one of the huge topics of discussions that happened around the middle of September. And to have two very intelligent and thoughtful people like Michael and Christine showing both sides of this scenario, I just think it was really valuable to hear both that. And also to have it, Christine's is more focused on the BYU Idaho section. That's where I went to school, so I have a little bit of a soft spot there. But to hear even how it's different between Provo and Idaho is also valuable.
Hugo Perego wrote a fascinating piece for the Interpreter Foundation. It's actually for their next journal, titled The Changing Forms of Latter-day Saint Sacrament. Partaking bread and water each Sunday, he says, is a fundamental part of the theology of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a solemn movement in which the mortal Savior's mission and ministry are remembered and pondered by those who partake individually and as a congregation, a review of how this practice has changed over time as part of the LDS liturgy. And there have been some vast changes in how we perform the sacrament.
And I think what I really like, too, is this is another area where the Mormon Interpreter is putting out some good work. You have to find it, and it's out there. But I don't think it's something that people should just shy away from. I think that there's lots of good avenues for Mormon scholarship right now.
Joseph Stewart at Juvenile Instructor gave a great summary of a launch event that happened at the Church History Department, regarding the new Joseph Smith Administrative Records, Volume 1, The Council of 50 Minutes. I actually had an opportunity to attend this event. Now, there's been a lot of talk about this book coming out.
Everything that the Joseph Smith papers have done have been very, very high quality and very, very well researched. And I've heard nothing but good things about it. And so now we really are getting to a point where, okay, it's not just whispers and a few documents someone may have seen here or there. They wrote some stuff down. Now we actually have documents out there so that some good scholarly research can be done, and we can start making connections with legitimate documents instead of just whispers and hearsay.
In addition to Joseph Stewart's article, Ben Park wrote a great article over at religionpolitics.org that we'll link to, titled The Mormon Council of 50, What Joseph Smith's Secret Records Reveal. And then, in addition to that, Deseret News wrote up a article on it as well that gave a great, just basic overview for church members. So we'll link to those as well.
David G. interviewed Nicholas Frederick, assistant professor of ancient scripture at BYU, for juvenile instructor about his book, The Bible, Mormon Scripture, and the Rhetoric of Elusivity from FDU Press. Frederick says, the argument essentially is this. The use of the New Testament in Mormon scripture, I believe, goes beyond simply a rhetorical appropriation, although I do think that's a part of it. What is remarkable about Mormon scripture is how not only the text, but also the context of the New Testament text is carried over into the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants. And at times, the context is expanded upon to introduce additional meaning. So I think this is really good, mostly because it seems like we're finally getting to a very mature and scholarly way of talking about Mormon scriptures. It seems like for a long time it was either proving it or disproving it, true or false, or it was focused on more of a devotional aspect. But seeing things like this and others that come out, I'm thinking of people like Grant Underwood, Terrell Givens, and others who are taking it more as a legitimate book of scripture. David Bokovoy is another great one. People who are taking it as a legitimate source of scripture and looking at it from a Mormon scholarly perspective. I think it adds a lot more depth to Mormon scriptures versus is it true or is it false, or just doing it as simply a devotional sort of material.
So Laura Harris Hales has announced a new podcast that she and a team of people are doing called LDS Perspectives Podcast. This was announced on Interpreter Foundation's website, but I'm not sure how involved directly it is with Interpreter, although there does seem to be a lot of crossover from the people that are conducting interviews on this podcast and some of the staff of Interpreter. But there's also other people on there, such as historian Russell M. Stevenson, who wrote the award-winning For the Cause of Righteousness with Greg Kofford Books. She wrote in her introduction to it that the field of Mormon studies has blossomed over the past 2 decades. There are more conferences to attend, more books to read, more articles delivered to our inboxes. Despite our desire to consume even a small portion of this great scholarship, there doesn't seem to be enough hours in the day to make our bookshelves any lighter. Enter the podcast that enables the curious and the serious learner to multitask their way to greater knowledge and understanding. And it looks like they get into things like they have done stuff on the historical Jesus so far, which was actually a really great episode. They are going to be doing some historical related stuff. They've got theology. They've got philosophy. So it looks like they're being fairly well-rounded. This might be a good podcast to check out for you.
I used to be really, really into Mormon podcasts, and I think we really hit a nice heyday in 2012. There's been a dearth of them recently, and I can tell you as a retired podcaster that was drug out of retirement by you, Brian, podcasting is kind of rough, and it's a bit of a grind. But I'm really happy to see that Laura is doing this, mostly because there is so much good stuff out there that still hasn't been discussed. I really like Laura, and I like her team, and I think they're going to do a great job. So congratulations to their team, because they just made it on my illustrious podcast queue.
So the fragments that we have were not the source of the Book of Abraham.
Okay, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Okay. That's what I thought it was, but I want to make sure. Kerry Milstein of the Mormon Interpreter has a very interesting piece up called Assessing the Joseph Smith Papyri, an Introduction to the Historiography of Their Acquisitions, Translations, and Interpretations. Milstein writes, new information suggests that while the relationship between the papyri and the text is not clear, it is clear that the fragments are not the source of the Book of Abraham, and that the method of translation was not the Kirtland Egyptian papers. Additionally, further investigations into the source of the Book of Abraham, as well as the interpretations of the facsimiles, have made it clear that much of the controversy around the Book of Abraham, or about the Book of Abraham, has been based on untested assumptions. Brian, I know that there's a lot of information out there about the Book of Abraham, the Egyptian papyri, and stuff like that. I thought this was interesting, mostly because it seems like he's taking a bit of a new angle on it instead of a lot of the previously tread ground. Sadly, I think I kind of know how, at least among the masses, how this is going to be interpreted. They're going to fall in their faith politics camps. But I'm really hoping that by taking some of this and having some new looks at it, it opens people's eyes a little bit to maybe taking a broader view of however you feel about the Egyptian papyri and the Book of Abraham.
I think it's definitely well worth the read, even if you're not somebody who looks at the Book of Abraham as being something that is an ancient text. I think it's well worth looking at some of these arguments.
Rational Faith has a new podcast series called the CES Podcast for the Rest of Us with Bible scholar Dr. Sheldon Graves and his co-host Michael Barker. Dr. Graves and Barker will be looking at this year's Seminary Institute's curriculum, which covers the New Testament, and will be distilling a week's worth of lessons and reading down to a half-hour podcast. I'm interested. I'm always interested to put new things on the podcast. I wonder, though, if doing a week's worth of lessons down to a half hour might be going really fast. I would like them to expand it out to an hour, but I understand both Mike and Dr. Graves have a life, and that can be difficult.
Yeah, we'll see how much depth they're able to pull out in that amount of time. Marianne at Wheaton Terrace wrote An Orthodox Theology of Heavenly Mother and a Caveat. She wrote, Heavenly Mother has been a hot topic on the blogs lately. Some attention is due to a new children's book that was published in early September by Deseret Book. She said other discussions centered around a recent Harvard Theological Review article by Taylor Petrie titled Rethinking Mormonism's Heavenly Mother, in which Petrie encouraged the exploration of Heavenly Mother theology within the bounds of a generous orthodoxy. When it comes to Heavenly Mother, though, it's difficult to pin down what we do believe within regular orthodoxy, let alone a generous one. And so she kind of goes through in this article and lists out, here's kind of, what we know and what we don't know about the belief of a Heavenly Mother within Mormonism. And it's very straightforward. It's very simple. But it's a good article as a good basis as for where the discussion really needs to launch from. And she's right. We have so much mystery shrouded around the concept of a Heavenly Mother that it's like, well, how can we talk about it in terms of a generous orthodoxy when we don't really know what our orthodoxy is on this topic? But I also love the idea that Taylor Petrie in his article, Rethinking Mormonism's Heavenly Mother, is proposing of this being one of those things that can be considered more generous orthodoxy.
Yeah, and not that anyone should be listening to any other podcast except for this podcast, but Malcolm Gladwell's Revisionist History is where you can find the podcast on generous orthodoxy, and I believe it's the last episode or second to last episode.
Something like that.
It's really, really good. I as a matter of fact, I was listening to it and I kept thinking about Mormonism as I was listening to it. It was one of those things where it's like I couldn't get it out of my head.
All right, should we talk about some book releases?
Let's do it.
Well, we've already given quite a bit of lip service to the Joseph Smith Papers administrative records for the Council of 50 from Church Historians Press, so I'm not going to say anything more than it's out, it's available. Highly recommend picking it up. It's actually a little bit more readable than some of the other Joseph Smith Papers books. If you're going to own one Joseph Smith Papers volume, I think this is a good one to pick up.
Ooh, that's a good recommendation.
Yeah.
I've tried really hard to be a good boy this year, so I'm hoping Santa Claus is going to hook me up. I'm just saying.
I think Santa was actually in the Council of 50.
Another book that should be on everyone's radar is Out of Obscurity, Mormonism Since 1945, which is edited by Patrick Mason and John Turner, put out by Oxford University Press, who is just doing such a good job. They sent me an advanced copy of this for the Mormon News Report. This is what I wrote about Out of Obscurity. The essays are divided into 4 areas: internationalization, political culture, genders and religious culture, And with essays by Christine Hagelin, Matthew Bowman, Andrea Hendricks Komodo, and more, it looks at the ways a 19th century church was not just thrust into the modern era, but flourished as well. The biggest chunk of essays is on Mormonism and politics, but it really does have something for everyone. Personally, I wanted more, but that just means there's more room to write about different subjects. It is really good, especially if you're interested in the modern church since 1945. I hope that this opens up more room for more volumes on it, because I think that it's an area that, especially that kind of 1940s area, that we might be able to start getting more information on. But it was really, really good. And Patrick Mason and John Turner, two of the greatest guys out there, and I was really happy to see them editing this volume.
Just my own personal opinion, because this is where my focus is as well, as is in 20th century Mormon studies. In my opinion, that has far more weight and gravity on the way that the church looks now and today than anything in the first century of its existence. Next book coming out here is Matthew L. Rasmussen published at the University of Utah Press, Mormonism and the Making of a British Zion. I think this one actually came out in July, so we're a bit late on it. To be honest, I actually haven't picked up a copy of this book yet, but it does look fascinating. And I think it also gets into this 20th century focus on looking at the shift from calling everybody to Zion, particularly in the British Isles, calling them to Zion being Utah, like through the Perpetual Immigration Fund and whatnot, to Heber J. Grant's and Joseph F. Smith's admonition that you grow Zion wherever you're planted.
Next up is Joseph Smith Seer Stones by Michael Hubbard McKay and Nicholas J. Frederick from the BYU Religious Studies Center Press. There was a lot of stuff going around last year about the LDS Church publishing high-quality photographs of these seer stones, making them available both on their website and in the Ensign. And this actually takes a lot of that enthusiasm around the seer stones and gets a little bit more in-depth with them. Personally, I think it's very important that this comes out from the BYU Religious Studies Center. If we're talking simply on a Mormonism in general landscape, I think that that's going to be a lot more palpable for people to be comfortable with the seer stones, the role that it played within Mormonism, specifically the role that it played within Joseph Smith's life. I think it's going to have a lot more marketability versus something that comes out from maybe a weighty academic press that most mainstream LDS people are just not going to be aware of.
Signature Books published this month The 13th Apostle, The Diaries of Amasa M. Lyman, 1832 to 1877. This was edited by Scott H. Partridge most of the way. Unfortunately, Scott Partridge passed away during the editing of this book, and so the Signature staff had to take over the project and finish it up, and it was actually John Hatch over at Signature that put in the majority of the final touches on this book. Amasa Lyman was a critical figure of the early church. He joined it just a couple of years after its formation. He came out here to Utah. He eventually was excommunicated for apostasy. Some of the things that Amasa was preaching was that the doctrine of resurrection was unnecessary, for instance, and that just kind of rubbed the other apostles the wrong way. He wouldn't relent on that, and eventually he was excommunicated from the church. And then posthumously, he was forgiven of his apostasy, and he was brought back into full fellowship of the church. And then finally, Greg Kofford Books has published this month The Trek East, Mormonism Meets Japan, 1901 to 1968 by Shinji Takagi. This book is really I'm going to call it a landmark study in the relationship between Mormonism and Japan and the missionary efforts that took place there very early on, and then were curtailed when Japan kind of retreated from Western society, and then picked back up again later on. He goes up to 1968. The thing that Shinji does in this book that I think is so essential is number one, he actually looks at Japanese documents because he's native Japanese himself, so he can actually read these original Japanese documents. The first scholar that we've had that has written a book on this topic that can actually read Japanese. And that's actually a pretty big deal. So not only does he have that going for him, but also he's a social scientist by training. And so he's able to look at this from the perspective of politics, of economics, and of outside forces, external pressures into the relationship between Mormonism and Japan. And quite frankly, there wasn't as much conversion as what the Brethren had initially hoped for, so they kind of withdrew their support for missionary efforts over there. This plays out in the book in a very interesting way, in the sense that was it a failure because the Japanese people were resistant, or was it a failure because we stopped supporting missionary efforts? So he bounces back and forth some pretty interesting arguments.
Well, and I think the great part about kind of what's happening now is you have people like Shinji in Japan and others who are taking Mormonism, and like you said, they're native to that area, and they have close ties to it. They can read the language, and so they can actually get in and do a lot more research. I served my mission in Korea, and Korea has a lot of the same issues, which is there's some very interesting stories there. There's some very interesting developments that happen with the LDS Church in Korea, but the Korean language is really hard, and so you need Koreans who can go through and read the primary documents. So to be able to have someone like Shinji take something like the LDS Church development within Japan, that's kind of monumental to be able to get to that point.
Okay, let's talk about some conferences and events coming up. This weekend, coming up at BYU, is the annual meeting for the Society for Mormon Philosophy and Theology. This organization has been around for quite a while now, and they've put together some fantastic programs in the past, and I expect no less from what's going to be coming up this weekend. Some of the presenters are going to be including David Paulson, who was a retired philosophy professor from BYU, Charles Harrell, who wrote the book This Is My Doctrine, The Development of Mormon Doctrine, fantastic book. Benjamin Huff, Kofford Books managing editor Lloyd Erickson will be there as well. Joseph Spencer, who we've talked about in past podcasts. In fact, his next book is going to be coming out next month with Kofford Books as well. Jenny Webb, who's just a fantastic writer and involved in both this and the Association for Mormon Letters. Jacob Baker, great philosopher. Blake Ostler, and many more. And it's a fantastic opportunity to go and listen to the more philosophical side of Mormon studies.
Next up, Spencer Fluman has a very special invitation for everyone. Join us October 29th to celebrate the Maxwell Institute's 10th anniversary. Hard to believe it's been 10 years. Help us celebrate our 10th anniversary on Saturday, October 29th, when Professor David F. Holland of the Harvard Divinity School delivers our annual Neil A. Maxwell Lecture. Mark your calendars and join us on October 29th at 7 p.m. in room 151 of the N. Eldon Tanner Building at BYU. I'm hoping they put that online because David Holland is one of those guys where I try and drop everything to see him. Yeah. So congratulations to Maxwell Institute. You know what you got to do.
Joseph Stewart wrote for a call for applicants for the Neil A. Maxwell Institute Summer Seminar. This is linked on the Juvenile Instructor as well as in Times and Seasons. We'll put both up. The Neil A. Maxwell Institute Summer Seminar has been going on for a number of years. It was originally created by Richard Bushman and Terrell Givens, and I think mostly Terrell Givens operates it now. But every year they get together for, 6 weeks or something, and they develop a paper. And then at the end of this period, they deliver the paper in a small conference, and a lot of these papers go on to be published. It's kind of a neat thing. They start really from nothing more than just finding a basic theme, and then students come in without a lot of preparation and are able to use the archives there at BYU as well as surrounding area. They give them a living stipend, they give them housing if necessary, and they just let them go to work. They meet every day for 8 hours with Terrell Givens and with other visiting scholars that come through, people who are very well published and seasoned, giving them tips and pointers on the research, on the construction and drafting of their arguments, of their papers. I mean, what a phenomenal opportunity. Admitted participants will receive a stipend of $3,000 in addition to housing accommodation if needed. This year's theme will be on Mormonism Confronts the World, how the LDS Church has responded to developments in science, culture, and religion.
So if any of you are interested in learning a little bit more about this summer seminar, Blair Hodges on the Maxwell Institute podcast, I want to say a couple of years ago, did interviews with a lot of people who were involved with the summer seminar. They talked a little bit about their experience in doing it and also the papers that they were covering. The other cool thing about this, too, is it's not just limited to Mormon scholars. There were quite a few people, at least two that I could think of off the top of my head, who were on this podcast series that Blair had done, who are not LDS. One of them actually from Michigan State University in my backyard. Finally, the Intellectual Life of Mormonism Fall Panel Discussion Series will be happening at the University of Utah. This is going in conjunction with Brian Birch's course that he's doing on the Intellectual Life of Mormonism. There's going to be They've already had one panel discussion. That was the one that we covered earlier. There's going to be three more. So there's going to be one on October 27th from 7 until 8:30 p.m. Writing Women's History in Mormonism, Old Challenges, New Prospects with Colleen McDaniel, Linda King Newell, and Kate Holbrook. On Thursday, November 17th, from 7 to 8:30 p.m., Race and Gender in Mormon Studies, Contemporary Perspectives with Margaret Toscano, Paul Reeve, and Ignacio Garcia, who is pending acceptance. And on Thursday, December 8th, from 7 till 8:30 p.m., the LDS Church and the Academic Study of Mormonism, Institutional Dynamics with Marlon K. Jensen, Spencer Fluman, and Grant Underwood. That one sounds like it'll be phenomenal. All these sound really, really good. But I'm so happy to see that the University of Utah is doing this because there's just such a wealth of information there, and they can bring such a very unique perspective to a lot of these Mormon studies initiatives.
Yeah, and quite a diverse cross-section of scholars
Absolutely.
at each of these panels. So, yeah, definitely, if you're out in the area, this is something definitely to check out. So,
and this is all free to the public as well.
Great. Well, that wraps us up for September for this month in Mormon Studies. Brandt, it's been great having you back, and let's do this again.
You got it. Thank you, Brian.